Welcome to NREI's Common Area Podcast. This podcast is brought to you by the award-winning editorial staff at NREIOnline.com. Let's jump right into this week's podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Common Area with your host, David Bodamer. Let's dive into this week's story. Hello, David. How are you?
I'm doing well this week. How are you?
Doing great. It's still wintertime. Just as a reminder to everybody listening for, when this publishes, and probably, I'm pretty sure it's still wintertime. It's still cold.
Still cold, but still no snow. No real snowfall in New York City.
Oh, good. Winter. Nice. Yeah. Well, we just have ice here, so that's, whatever. Anyway, you can't build anything with ice really, except for maybe igloos, and that's just too much effort. So I'm not going to do it. So, all right. So what are we talking about today?
So today we're going to talk about a big merger was announced. As of us recording this, it was announced a couple of days ago. In that Simon Property Group agreed to buy Taubman Centers for a deal that's being, I think, roughly valued at about $3.6 billion.
Wow.
And aside from just the headline, it's been covered to death because it is, I think the largest retail real estate merger we've had in a couple of years. It's news on that level. But I wanted to talk about it as well, just because there's a lot of really interesting history between these companies. And so that I don't think as many people are aware of. And I don't see it even being mentioned I put some of it in our coverage, but I don't see it being mentioned as broadly. And I think it's sort of interesting to kind of look back at what had happened before and then and then sort of figure out how they got to the point where they could do this.
Okay. Sounds good.
For me, one of the so this deal happens. Simon and Taubman, both companies, Taubman is about a 70-year-old entity, one of the original shopping center players. Mm-hmm. And Simon came along not that long after. I think they were founded about 10 years later. And over the years have been two of the preeminent regional mall companies in the country, first as just developers. And, a lot of these companies, a lot of the big mall companies that are around today, they all kind of came out of the Midwest. And they were all these sort of interesting guys that started out as just developers and built a project and kind of were figuring out how they were going to program malls and develop what we know today. And they all sort of knew each other. They were all based in sort of Indianapolis and Michigan and Iowa. But so that's kind of the cradle of the shopping center industry in this country. So these companies both come from that heritage. Through the years, they grew, become eventually become part of the REIT revolution, which is in the 1990s, when all these companies go from being privately run family shops to publicly traded companies, although still kind of tightly own, the families that start these companies are still the executives and still own controlling interest in the stock even to this day. So that's what we have. Taubman Companies is founded by Alfred Taubman, 1950. Simon Property Group originally was called, I think, Mel Simon and Associates. It's went through a few different name changes over the years. Started by two brothers, Mel and Herbert Simon, and now both companies are run by the next generation, the sons of those respective fathers.
Got it.
So two sons are part of Taubman's leadership team, and then Mel Simon's son, David Simon, has been the CEO of Simon Property Group for the last, a couple decades, I guess. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of one piece of history, just that these companies that are part of the very birth of this industry that have been two of the dominant players in their own ways. Simon's been dominant by just being the largest regional mall owner in the country, and they have been that for many, many years. Taubman's niche was a little bit different, which is they specialized in particularly high-end regional malls. And for many years, they had the industry-leading sales per square foot of any portfolio in the country. So they were, and a lot of their centers were more high-end. So they didn't have as large a portfolio, but their portfolio was just really high performing and really, really prestigious top level centers. And they took that model to some levels of success internationally as well. They opened some malls in Asia. They had a subsidiary company over there for a while. So these are two just very, very successful companies.
Gotcha.
Then what though happened was Alfred Taubman also at one point was the owner of Sotheby's, and in the late 90s, early 2000s, I don't know if you remember this, but there was a bit of a scandal with Sotheby's where they were caught doing some accused of doing price fixing and inflate and kind of like messing around with the auctions a little bit, and eventually they pled guilty, had to do a settlement, and Taubman even went to jail for I think it was less than a year, but it was pretty serious.
Wow.
So he got caught up in this, admitted that he messed up, accepted his jail term, and went and did that. While that was happening, at this point, he was no longer the CEO of Taubman Centers, but he was still the chairman of the company. And they said, so before his sons were still running the company, still family owned, still a big part of his legacy. During this period, when he is in prison, Simon launched a hostile takeover bid. For Taubman Centers, and this went on for months and months. They put in an initial bid. Taubman said no. They raised it. They recruited actually another company to kind of help them do a higher bid. They got into all sorts of crazy legal battles, legislative battles. Both sides just kind of really Taubman really resisting this effort, Simon fighting pretty hard, trying to take them over, left both sides with eventually Taubman was able to obviously fight off this effort, not before both companies spent a bunch in legal fees and took some real shots at each other. So it is then interesting that after all of that happens, here we are 20 years later, and now the two sides come together and cut a deal.
Yeah, seriously. A couple things. Number one, way to go, attorneys. You made a ton of money for nothing. Number two, it sounds to me like, especially with the ages, you've got two warring kingdoms here, old kings that have been sitting on these thrones, lobbing shots at each other across the moats and things. One of them tries to take over the other person's castle, and now they're having their son and daughter marry, and so they're merging families.
Yeah.
It's drama. It's a lot of drama, man.
A lot of drama, but I guess I mean, from what I understand, in the years since David Simon and Robert Taubman, who are now the respective CEOs, have kind of smoothed things out. They're part of the same industry association, or the same industry conferences. I think they've had a chance to. It sounds like they've had a chance to really sit down and go through whatever they needed to go through from that period, but also start to look at what makes sense going forward. And it seems that part of this today is what it's being driven by is that, Taubman's in a position where, they haven't grown their portfolio very much. We've talked a lot about obviously the struggles with malls in general, just given what's going on with retail. So it seems like, and they were also facing a bit of a thing where there's now an activist investor who's part of their board, who I think has been pushing, they were going to have an upcoming elections for their corporate board within a few months, and all 9 seats were up. There was potential that they could lose controlling interest of the board, and then therefore, the family would lose maybe some of their opportunity to decide what the ultimate fate was. So I think they came up. So it seems like part of what's happened here is to head off an uncertain situation and maybe being forced to sell under different circumstances. They found a deal now that they think works, puts them underneath the Simon umbrella, keeps the Taubman family in charge of this portfolio. Just now Simon will own 80% of have an 80% interest in their entity, and the family will retain the other 20%. Meanwhile, shareholders, current Taubman shareholders, are getting a payout that was of a pretty substantial premium of where Taubman shares were trading the day before the deal was announced.
Gotcha. All right.
So, and I think also from Taubman's perspective, what it brings is Simon has just got a bigger platform. They are the dominant player, so it potentially just takes there's ways for them to, I think, maybe leverage their portfolio in a new way, given they'll have now the backing of the premier owner in the industry.
And
yeah, I guess now the the families will be one new family.
Oh, and I'm sure they'll have Thanksgiving together and, Christmases or Hanukkahs or whatever's going on over there. I'm sure it's just peace, love, and harmony.
Yeah.
I'm really curious about that, how it's going to affect the quote unquote home office of both groups, right? I mean, what is has there been any word on what that looks like?
I don't think, not too much detail yet. I mean, the deal has to go through the necessary approvals first. I think both boards for both companies have signed off on the deal, but it's got to go through, SEC and other shareholder approval and all that kind of stuff, which takes a few months, I think, before they start getting into some of the brass tacks. I mean, Taubman is historically based in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, like I said, and Simon is in Indianapolis. It sounds like, at least my understanding is that, the Taubman, the executive team for Taubman is staying on. Like they're not cashing out, and it's not that the malls are just going to be fully integrated into Simon's portfolio. The Taubman kind of name is going to continue to live on as just sort of an entity that's owned by Simon. And should be pointing out that Simon's kind of done this thing before, where they've bought other companies and then continued to operate the properties, at least some or all, under the old company name, and partly as a way of distinguishing those properties. In some cases, like they had bought some outlet centers. They had also bought these the Mills properties, which were very unique properties. I don't know how many of them are still like functioning in that same way, but they, for years there was like, they had these subsidiaries that continued to kind of be a little bit different from what was in the core properties. They also bought one of the other old industry families was the Glimsher family, and Simon had bought Glimsher Property Trust, I don't know, sometime in the last decade as well. So they do have and of course the original thing was when Simon and DeBartolo company merged, which was like, I'm forgetting the year on that, but Eddie, the DeBartolo family that owns the 49ers, they used to be a major mall owner and rivaling Simon in scale and size, and at one point, those two companies merged.
Yeah.
So Simon's got a very long history of, they've developed and built their own properties, but they've also done a lot of their growing by buying up other companies and a handful of these other companies, which were part of that same like original class of like these old, like I was saying, like these Midwest guys in the 50s and 60s that were kind of, birthing this industry.
Yeah, I find this fascinating mainly because of our previous conversations on previous podcasts, David. Honestly, we talk about online shopping and all the different things that outlet centers are doing, and
right.
Like the grocery shopping center. A lot of those stores that are around a grocery store do well because, everybody goes to the grocery store, but a mall is something different. And we've spoken about malls before, so I'm really interested to see what happens here. Simon obviously knows something. They know how to run a business, which is good. But with this, the fact that I think Amazon starts dropping things on your doorstep using drones and things, I don't know how long it's going to be before a lot of these malls are shutting doors, unless they can all switch to that whole rent some yoga pants model that we were talking about in another podcast as well. I don't know. That's just weird.
Yeah, well, and I mean, to Simon's credit, they've also been extremely aggressive and creative in trying to keep their property successful. In some cases, they've bought or invested in struggling retailers to keep them alive. So a few years ago, they basically, along with a couple other entities, bought Aeropostale when they were about to shut down, infused them with capital, and kept them going. And like, they're actually healthier, like there was going to be like 500 store closings that didn't happen because Simon got involved. And I think Aeropostale is in a much better place today. And now they're doing the same thing, trying to do the same thing with Forever 21, who was about to shut down all their stores. And instead Simon is part of the group that's coming in and trying to keep them going. They've also have, a number of things they've done on the mall level for programs and to facilitate to provide some services to the tenants to help them compete with online sales, or to allow people to do order online and pick up at the mall. Like, they're very aggressive, and it's partly because they are so well capitalized. I think I've seen them just describe themselves as being, they're not just a developer anymore, but they consider themselves part of the retail business and part of trying to help keep their tenants successful in this climate that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of, I think, also like what the potential benefit for Taubman is, because I don't think that they have developed these kind of services or capabilities to the level that Simon has, and now they can kind of capitalize on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, that's good news for all the retail shops out there that are, still hoping that malls are going to be attractive in the next 5 to 10 years. So that's good.
Yeah, and and it's sort of one other tangent that what you said sparked to me is that, I always found Alfred Taubman such an interesting figure, partly because of just this history he had, but he also he wrote a memoir that came out about 12, 13 years ago as well.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. It's called Threshold Resistance. And he was one of the guys that kind of came up with the idea, like what you're talking about, like the concept of taking a grocery store strip center and thinking about how you do the other inline tenants. He was the guy that helped do that for regional malls and really thought about, during the creation of these centers and figuring out how to do it, like how many anchor stores you should have and how far apart they should be and what stores made the most sense to put next to them. And he was just very involved with the initial success of programming regional malls. Obviously it's, a different proposition today, but he was, that's part of what he was. He had a really great mind for retail. That whole concept of threshold resistance, which he talked about, was this idea that behaviorally, when people are shopping or they're walking down a street and they see a store window, what actually makes them go inside the store? Mm-hmm. So there's people have a hesitation when they're walking past the store. They may see something and it's like their initial reaction is probably to not go in. So how do you break that resistance to get them to cross the threshold? And everything he did, a lot of what he did was about trying to get people to do that. So he had all sorts of interesting things he wrote about in the book, and ways that he encouraged retailers to change what they did in their store windows. And there also used to be, like, if you go down like any older downtown streets, there is that old store design. I don't know if you could picture this, where, like, rather than having a door that's just right on the sidewalk, it's set back, and there you'll have like 2 long window cases, with lots of stuff in it. That whole walk, that like 10 to 15 foot walk to get people through the door, actually ends up being that was a pretty big barrier, like getting people to actually walk through that. People thought by doing that they would create all this extra display space to put all their merchandise, and then with that, so it would be a great store design to do this. What he found was that it was actually a terrible thing to do. It wasted your real estate, and actually getting people to walk that extra 15 feet to the door was a barrier. So, like, that's why you don't see that anymore.
Yeah.
You see, like, do like just, storefronts on the street or like in the mall. So again, breaking, this concept of threshold resistance.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. You want to be able to have somebody open the door and then be enveloped by the store instead of having to walk that 10 to 15 feet, looking at all these things, feeling like I'm in this tunnel to get in there. Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah. And we talked to some analysts and other industry figures, and everybody seems to think that this is going to be a good deal. But like I said, for me, it's just in addition to just the narrative of what they do going forward and how this may strengthen, how these two companies complement each other. There's just like a fascinating amount of history tied up in these companies, and seeing them end up together is just, I find it very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Didn't you have an opportunity to do an interview as well? We were talking a little bit before the podcast about that.
Yeah, I did. I mean, back when he, when Mr. Taubman had wrote the memoir, I did interview him about, and I reviewed the book actually as well. Like,
Oh, really?
it's a little deeper in our archives, but I did an interview with him, and I reviewed the book back for when I was. We used to have a sister publication about retail real estate, that's where I was based at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole thing we did. He actually also he passed away a few years ago when he was about 95. But yeah, it was I think it was some years before that when he was still, he was just this very interesting guy.
That's cool.
He had this little office in New York City. He ran a little holding company out of it. Like I said, he was kind of still the chairman of the board of the of Taubman Centers, but it was really being run by his two sons at that point, and he was just doing this other sort of investments, and he was out of Sotheby's at this point. But that was my chance to kind of to talk to him and find and have him explain some of this stuff to me directly.
Yeah, that's really cool that you're kind of coming full circle now with this and this story, and being able to lead the way with this and kind of keep an eye on the company and see how it's developed, over the 70 years or so it's been developing, but also since you had an opportunity to meet him in person and talk to him and interview him. That's great.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else we need to take away from this story?
No, I think that covers it.
All right. Well, good deal. I don't know how many other Mall families are out there, so I'm curious if Simon has other,
There's still a few. I wonder, actually, yeah, maybe not as many left, like I was thinking, because like there was also the Bucksbaums who founded General Growth Properties, but they're now out of the business, more or less. At least, their company, General Growth Properties, has been integrated into another company. There was James Rouse, who was another one of these leading early figures, and their company got bought years ago. So a lot of the families are now, or these traditional family companies, have been snapped up. There's probably a few others that I'm forgetting, but
yeah. Well, it's kind of like the game Monopoly. They're getting their hands on all of it. Park Place is next, baby.
Yeah.
Something like that. Boardwalk, Park Place, somewhere in there. All right, David. Well, I thank you for your time. I think this was a great podcast. I learned a ton, and I loved it. So if somebody wants to read the entire article, where do they get it?
Yeah, it's NREIonline.com. We have an analysis piece about this deal, and I put in, and there are some links in there to these older pieces that from 15 years ago about the coverage of we had at the time of the hostile takeover efforts, and my interview with Mr. Taubman.
Great. All right. I'll look forward to it. Thanks again, David. And thank you all for listening to the Common Area Podcast with David Bodamer. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when David comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. This makes it much easier to share these podcasts with your colleagues. Again, thanks for listening today. For everyone at NREI, this is Eric Johnson inviting you back in 2 weeks for all the stories that matter to you. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Common Area Podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of NREI or Informa. The content has been made available for information and educational purposes only.